For almost the entire duration of World War II, the people of the United States slept safely in their beds. They believed the war was something happening over there, across the Atlantic in Europe, or thousands of miles away in the Pacific. They believed the oceans protected them. They were wrong. In June 1942, that illusion of safety was shattered. The Imperial Japanese Army did the unthinkable. They invaded and occupied United States territory. For the first time since the War of 1812, enemy boots were on American soil. This isn't a what-if scenario. This is the true, forgotten story of the Battle of Attu, the coldest, bloodiest, and most terrifying fight for North America. To understand why thousands of men had to die on a frozen rock at the edge of the world, you have to look at the map. The Aleutian Islands stretch out from Alaska like a jagged spear pointing directly at the heart of the Japanese Empire. But that spear points both ways. General Billy Mitchell, the father of the U.S. Air Force, once warned that whoever holds Alaska holds the world. When Japan seized the islands of Attu and Kiska, panic swept the American West Coast. In Seattle and San Francisco, citizens blacked out their windows. Rumors flew that these islands would become air bases for Japanese bombers to strike American cities. The United States military had no choice. They could not ignore an invasion of their own continent. They had to take the islands back. The mission fell to the U.S. 7th Infantry Division. But as the ships left the harbor, there was a fatal flaw in the plan. These men weren't trained for the Arctic. They were trained for the scorching deserts of North Africa. They were issued summer uniforms. They wore standard leather boots. They were marching into a freezer, dressed for the beach. On May 11, 1943, Operation Land Crab began. The Americans expected a quick fight against a demoralized enemy. Instead, they stepped into a different kind of hell. The Japanese weren't waiting on the beaches. In fact, the beaches were empty. The enemy was the island itself. Attu is home to the Williwaw, a wind that screams down the mountain passes at 120 miles per hour. The fog is so thick and constant that pilots called it soup, often reducing visibility to 0 in seconds. Within days of landing, the American offensive stalled. Vehicles sank into the tundra mud up to their axles. Artillery couldn't be moved. Supplies were stuck on the beach. But the worst part was the cold. Because of their improper leather boots, water seeped in and froze against the skin. Trench foot set in, then gangrene. Men who hadn't even seen a Japanese soldier yet were being carried off the line with rotting feet, screaming in pain. The 7th Infantry was fighting for survival before they even fired a shot. The Japanese commander, Colonel Yamasaki, was smart. He knew he couldn't win a head-on battle against American battleships, so he lured them in. He waited until the Americans were crammed into the valley floors, surrounded by high, snowy ridges. Then he opened fire. The Japanese were dug into caves and spider holes high in the mist. They used smokeless powder so the Americans couldn't see where the bullets were coming from. It became a deadly game of King of the Hill, played with grenades and bayonets. The Americans had to climb slippery, ice-covered rocks, clearing out enemy caves one by one. It was slow, it was brutal, and it lasted for weeks. By the end of May, the situation for the Japanese was hopeless. They were cornered in a small harbor. They were starving, cut off from supply, and freezing to death. The American commanders believed the battle was effectively over. They expected a surrender, but they didn't understand the enemy they were fighting. May 29th, before dawn, the American soldiers were sleeping in their foxholes or eating breakfast in the rear medical tents. The front line was quiet. Suddenly, a sound pierced the fog, a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. It was one of the largest Banzai charges of the entire Pacific War. Every single Japanese soldier left alive charged. And it wasn't just the infantry. It was the wounded men from the hospital dragging their crutches. It was the engineers. It was the officers.
This wasn't a tactical assault, it was mass suicide. They overran the American front lines simply by the weight of numbers. They crashed into the command posts. They burst into the medical tents, bayoneting doctors and patients in their beds. The fighting dissolved into a primitive brawl, rocks, rifle butts, fists. The 7th Division engineers, cooks, and medics had to grab whatever weapon they could find and fight for their lives in the mud. When the sun finally rose over the valley, the screaming had stopped. The charge had failed. Colonel Yamasaki was dead, sword in hand, along with almost his entire garrison. The silence that followed was deafening. The cost of retaking this forgotten rock was staggering. Of the 2,900 Japanese defenders, only 28 surrendered. The rest fought to the death. The Americans suffered nearly 4,000 casualties, but the tragedy is in the details. For every American soldier shot by a bullet, another was taken out by the cold. Today, the wind still howls over Attu. The island is uninhabited. Rusting artillery shells, empty bunkers, and the wreckage of crashed planes still sit in the tall grass, untouched for 80 years. They serve as a grim memorial to the men who fought the forgotten war, the only battle of World War II fought on North American soil. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories from the forgotten fronts of World War II, make sure to subscribe and click the video on your screen now.